on social media, talking about social media. This is from the textbook. This is chapter one from the textbook by Arntfield and Swart. The first chapter is about cyberbullying, suicide, and the cycle of abuse. Um, we'll be in this textbook for the next 7 weeks, and then we'll finish up the semester talking about gaming. And I have a textbook that I will be getting my lecture from. You guys don't need a copy of it. I won't force you to buy another copy. We've had enough trouble with trying to get these two books. If anybody needs a copy of the Hesley and Hesley book, send me your address and I will send you a copy of it. So let's go ahead and get started with whatever this is. Social media, talking about social media. A lot of interesting information about social media. Okay, there we go. Don't ask me where I got this PowerPoint slide. These PowerPoint slides. Actually, I got them for free. There's a site on the internet, free PowerPoint templates, and this is one of them. And I thought, oh, that's pretty close. The original utopian vision of cyberspace, imparted by its pioneers as an egalitarian platform to connect people, to create a common bond between different cultures, creeds, and personalities, did not materialize as planned. And of course, best laid plans of mice and men, all the positive things about that people come up with. There's always negatives that go along with the positives. Unfortunately, the internet has a lot of negatives. Right now, Elon Musk is being sued, and he may have to buy Twitter. I think it is. Yeah, I think it's yeah. He may have to buy Twitter because he said he was going to. Oh my goodness. And we're going to talk about this. And eventually we're going to find out the number one thing that people do on the internet is look at pornography. But, and that wasn't anticipated by anybody. Of course, these were academics, and the academics were saying, oh, look, we can communicate with each other. This will be wonderful. And it was wonderful for the academics. And this is one of the reasons why Apple, if you buy an Apple computer, and you're a student or you are in education, you can get a 10% discount because initially Apple was the Apple computer was put together to help people in education. And of course, they anticipated that that's what would happen, and then people started putting pictures of other naked people online, and that became really popular. And now we've got TikTok videos and whatnot that I don't think they have anything to do with, they don't have to have anything to do with sex. As a matter of fact, I think TikTok videos that don't have anything to do with sex are just as popular as ones that do. But yeah, we've got that, and we have Instagram. Um, there's what else is out there? Well, anyway, Donald Trump tried to start his own social media platform. Didn't work out very well. Hasn't worked out very well so far. Truth, the Truth platform or whatever. Anyway, okay, so let's talk about the perils of the internet. The web, like all frontiers, has become another battlefield that often magnifies and intensifies differences and inequalities rather than cultivating empathy and understanding. Users have become overwhelmingly concerned with the illusory rather than the real, living in imagined communities online with the architecture of specific apps first and in the real world second. And sadly, of course, so does this lady look like this or does she look like this? And the answer is that's what she really looks like. Okay. In all cases, the overriding illusion users are expected to sustain is one of projected happiness vis-a-vis being popular, financially successful, and in demand. And I imagine if she looked like that, she would be far more in demand than if she looked like That, okay. Oh, she's not gonna get very many people wanting to look at her if she looks like that. Okay, there we go. She's probably more in demand if she looks like that. With more than 92% of teens going online daily, and almost a quarter of all adolescents in the United States describing their being online almost constantly, the internet has an extraordinary effect on the psychology of our youth, including, and sadly, suicide. This is Honey Boo Boo uh, checking her phone constantly. She doesn't see very well, evidently. She has to hold her phone really close to her face in order to see. She doesn't want anybody to see her with glasses on, of course. Anyway, so one quarter of the adolescent population are online almost constantly. And as an instructor, of course, and I've been teaching for 30 years, so I saw this from the very beginning, and I watched people checking their phones. And of course, it didn't happen very much in class uh, 25 years ago or 20 years ago. Of course, they didn't really have very good cell phones back then. But as cell phones became smartphones, it was almost constant, and I could look out on a class of 30 people, and 25 of them would be checking their cell phones. Um, my daughter teaches high school, and what she has to do is have the students put their cell phones at the front of the room. They can't have them at their desks. Of course, I'm a little bit more flexible than my daughter. She's kind of a she's kind of mean, but I can remember having students who would put their cell phone beside their computer, and if they had a message, of course, it would vibrate, and they'd flip it over, and they'd look at what they were looking at, and they'd flip it back over so that they weren't looking at it because it was distracting for them. Any investigation into the negative effects of the internet and social media on individual and societal health and functioning is likely to cite depression as a recurring symptom among users. Now, one of the things I need to tell you at this point, because we are getting into the Arntfeld, Field, and Swart book, is that most of this is, I've taken most of this from the textbook. I don't want you to think that I came up with all of this. Some of it I've changed the grammar a little bit, but all of this is quoted right from the textbook. And the reason I've done this is because right now I'm putting together two different classes. One class is this one, and the other one is cognitive psychology. And I really don't have enough time to synthesize this information and then come up with my own PowerPoint. Well, these are my own PowerPoints. Sadly, the book company did not produce any supplemental material for the instructors, and that's why the quizzes look the way that they do. Of course, I always make up my own quizzes, but the most of this comes right directly from the textbook. And I need to tell you that. I need to tell you that this is plagiarized primarily because I don't want to infringe on copyright laws. Since they gave me a copy of the book, and you have a copy, you all have a copy of the book, you can read this in your textbook. But I need to tell you that so that I don't infringe on the copyright laws. Of course, this PowerPoint is for your consumption only, and primarily that's the only people that look at my lectures. You guys are the only ones that look at my lectures anyway. So that is just something I need to tell you, just in case Cognella decides they want to sue me for copyright infringement. These symptoms are observable both online and through measurable behaviors offline, including acts of suicide, attempted suicide, and self-mutilation. And of course, these are part of the problems of the internet. We're getting these really strange communities where people talk about how to commit suicide. They make suicide pacts, and there are there are communities out there that perform self-mutilation, and they support these types of behaviors. Addiction, cyberbullying, exposure to violent and sexual content, coercion and influence to engage in harmful and maladaptive behaviors, and different mechanisms of polarized opinion forming have all been linked to depression among susceptible individuals. And of course, this is another part of the problem. The QAnon phenomenon. QAnon is a conspiracy theorist. He practically took over the federal government. He um, QAnon was very much in favor of the January 6th insurrection that took place, trying to stop the vote counting of the Electoral College. So there are really interesting communities out there, and some of them, sadly, some of them are negative. And of course, if you get what they call it is going down the rabbit hole. If you start reading somebody's internet postings and you start believing what they tell you, even though they have no support, then that is going down the rabbit hole. And of course, adolescents are trying to be parts of groups. That's the job of the adolescent, is to become a member of the adolescent community, and to break away from their family. This is the time when they break away from their family. So these negative websites can create lots of havoc in an adolescent's young mind. According to CDC, more than 8% of 2,200,000 or 200, I'm sorry, more than 8% or 2,200,000 teens between the age of 12 and 17 in the United States reported more than 14 mentally unhappy days in the past month. Uh, my wife is currently down in North Carolina with her brother, who just had surgery. He has a teenage son that's 15 years old, and she said he will not talk to anybody. He has his earbuds in all the time, and I would be curious to find out what he's listening to on his earbuds. But I would imagine that he's one of the individuals that has 14 mentally unhappy days every month. Suicide is the third leading cause of death of 15 to 24-year-olds in the United States, with nearly 8% of high school students attempting suicide at least once a year. Almost twice as many have thought about it. So we have 8% of the adolescent population has 14 unhappy days per year. And we also have 8% of the high school students attempting suicide at least once a year. For young people predisposed to depression, hopelessness, low self-esteem, sensitivity to judgment and criticism, and insecurities, the internet tends to magnify these qualities rather than relieve or mitigate them. Such a vulnerable person may seek escape or approval online and engage in risky online behaviors to try and accomplish such an objective. They are more likely to have a heightened sensitivity level to perceived criticism and rejection. They may lack the resilience and functional coping to deal with negative incidents effectively. Elevated risk of suicide. These are some of the risk factors. Talking about feeling hopeless or aimless. Talking about displaying themes of suicide and dying. Changes in behavior that may be apparent online, such as changing friends or engaging in reckless behavior or commentary. Mentioning medical or health issues. These are all things that if you see these are an SOS. These are SOSs that this person is so depressed that they may potentially attempt suicide or complete suicide. So if you see somebody with these risk factors that are engaging in these activities, you need to do something about it. More risk factors: evincing some sign of personal loss or struggle with a romantic relationship. Um, I have been around adolescents a lot, and people that attempt suicide. A lot of times, somebody just broke up with them. This is their final gesture is to commit suicide, to show this person how much they love them. Of course, this is an adolescent thought. This is not an adult. Well, some adults will do this as well. But relationships, if a relationship breaks up, you need to keep a close eye on that individual to make sure that none of these risk factors come to the fore. If they do, then you need to do something about it. This is the major reason for people adolescents to commit suicide, is because a relationship has broken up. Expressing uncertainty or apathy about the future, evincing a struggle with sexuality, identity. So if they don't feel male or female, that they have a different sexual orientation, they changed their pronouns. These individuals tend to be picked on, and for that reason, and since they feel different than everybody else, one of the things you need to do is watch them to make sure that they don't get too depressed. Showing signs of out of character aggressiveness or agitation. It's especially the agitation part. Agitation is deadly. Agitation is deadly for old people. If you see an old person who normally acts fairly pleasant, and all of a sudden they get agitated about everything, there's things going on in their brain. And something may be happening in their brain. I had a father-in-law who started acting agitated, and about 2 weeks later he had a stroke. But there was something going on in his mind. He was having these TIAs, these ischemic, episodes, and so tiny parts of his brain were dying, and that's what was causing him agitation, mainly because he couldn't remember things. And normally he had a pretty good memory, and all of a sudden he stopped being able to remember things. The agitation caused a problem, and of course that was the sign that there was something going on, that we needed to do something. Of course, back then there was nothing you could do. Now, of course, if somebody has a stroke, especially if it's a blood clot, then we can take care of that. More risk factors of suicide. Displaying recurring or obsessive interest in extreme or socially unacceptable views of practices, engaging in acts of cyberbullying, for example, posting threats, flaming, demeaning comments, evincing radical changes in the frequency of internet use. And this really has to do with increasing the amount of internet use, not the decreasing of internet use. All of these are risk factors, and if you see them, then you need to ensure yourself that that individual is okay, that they're resilient, that they're not going to take their own life. The associations between internet use and suicide are complex and mostly indirect in nature, and thus they're seldom empirically validated. In other words, we cannot connect internet usage with suicide. We can't do that. It's not a direct line between, oh, they've increased their internet usage, they're going to commit suicide. Oh, they're starting to go down the rabbit hole, they're going to commit suicide. We can't do that. It has to do with a change in internet usage. It has to do with types of sites that they see. But normally people don't know what sites people are going on to when they're in their room at 2 o'clock in the morning. While you're asleep, what are they doing? What sites are they looking at? You don't have any clue. Determining any linear cause and effect or causal relationship between specific computer-mediated behaviors and self-harm is simply not scientifically possible, because everybody is different. And when we talk about computer-mediated behaviors, we're also talking about, of course, smartphones. Recent research highlighted the issue that the internet can encourage suicidal behavior or hinder suicide prevention. The first factor is the immense quantity of information that is available online for anyone interested in suicide methods, thereby providing a sort of how-to guide. How do you commit suicide? They will tell you how to do it. Another worrying aspect is the relation between cyberbullying victimization and suicidal behaviors through psychological stress processes. Victims of cyberbullying are almost 2 times more likely to attempt suicide than those not involved. The existence of cyber suicide pacts, usually formed online between strangers, has increased in places, whereas the anonymity of online chat rooms and virtual bulletin boards creates a disinhibition effect and becomes an unmediated platform to share views and feelings. Instigators are often mentally unstable, but able to influence or convince others who are vulnerable to follow their example. And of course, that has to do with these cyber suicide pacts that people make. Let's jump off the ledge together. Recent occurrences of clusters of cyber suicide pacts, primarily in Japan, suggest a form of contagion that mirrors the media contagion effect found after highly publicized incidents. The immediacy and reach of social media probably add to the virulence of this phenomenon. And of course, the Japanese are known for this type of behavior. This is relatively common in Japan, not so much in the United States. One of the things that you have to remember about Japan is that 98% of the population are Japanese. In the United States, of course, we have a very diverse population. And because of our diversity, we have a lot of different ideas being put together. But in Japan, 98% of them are Japanese. 98% of the people living in Japan are Japanese. And they kind of have similar ideas. They look alike. Well, they don't look alike, of course. Nobody does. But they tend to have similar ideas, and it's the culture of Japan. It's really hard to compare Japan with any other country because no country is as homogenous as Japan is. You go to Korea, the population is a lot more diverse. You go to China, they have a lot of different areas of China, and they have 2 different diets. They have northern China their diet is mostly wheat, and in the south it's mostly rice. So lots of differences in other countries, not so much in Japan. I don't mean to pick on Japan, but it's just a far more homogeneous area than just about any place else. Video sharing websites continue to grow exponentially after the creation of YouTube in 2005. The many pro-suicide and self-harm videos that are available online may normalize and reinforce self-injurious behaviors among those who are already vulnerable. These, often with explicit content, also cause emotional blunting and disinhibition of viewers, almost similar to the consumption of graphic, violent material, which contributes to lower objectivity and hesitation. And of course, the bloodier the media that you watch, the less that you will respond to blood and gore if you ever see it in real life. The internet also facilitates the formation and functioning of extreme communities online, groups that promote beliefs and behaviors that are harmful and usually unacceptable by the social mainstream or are unlawful, such as body modification, anorexia and genital mutilation, illegal substance use, and the acts of violence. Now, this is actually from a positive side. This is what she looked like, and this is after she recovered. It has to do with she wanted to look good, and there was a website that would induce anorexic individuals to start bodybuilding, and this is actually what this is. There were a number of pictures of women who had been anorexic at one point and who were now bodybuilders. That's a positive thing that the internet has done. That is not a very good look for just about anybody unless you are coming out of a German concentration camp. But she looks pretty good over here. I'm real pleased that she is now healthy. Now, the interesting thing about people who suffer from anorexia nervosa is that the relapse rate is fairly high. The other problem that people that suffer from anorexia have is that they have a difficult time maintaining a normal body weight. It's usually a couple percent below the norm, and that's for the rest of their life, of course. That is way too slender for anybody. Social media creates and exacerbates documented mood disorders. 1 in 3 teens in the United States reported having been the target of cyberbullying during the transitional years to Web 2.0 and smart devices in the mid to late 2000s. While more recent figures have curiously proven elusive, the latest scholarship suggests that members of the LGBTQ+, in particularly high school and college students aged 13 to 25, are the more overrepresented groups of victims, the most overrepresented groups of victims, regardless of gender identity. So the LGBTQ++ community is very frequently they become the victims of cyberbullying. Social interactions such as communicating, sharing, and belonging are an integral part of mental health and well-being. When any factor, most commonly fear and shame, interferes with the desire and willingness to engage socially, a person is at risk of alienation, which is associated with a sense of low belongingness. The resulting feelings of hopelessness and worthlessness are the two psychological states most linked to self-harm and a desire for death. A comparatively recent 2010 study conducted with 463 public middle and high school students in Central Texas found that 84.9% of the students were not involved in bullying. That means that 15% of the students were involved with bullying, while 2.3% fell into the victim group, 2.2% into the bully group, and the remaining 10.9% were not only victims, but they are also bullies. This is the victim-bully group. The results suggest that most individuals involved in bullying behaviors are both victims and perpetrators of cyberbullying and other delinquent online behaviors. So they got picked on, so they pick on somebody else. Strangely, we're going to see this again. So only 2.3% were victims and 2% were bullies, but 10.9% were both victims and bullies. There is a high correspondence between cyber and traditional perpetration and between cyber and traditional victimization. This means that youth who are involved in traditional bullying are also involved in cyberbullying. The bully victim group scored highest on all aspects, with the bully group a close second. Somewhat surprisingly, the victim group trailed significantly behind in each aspect, although still coming in higher than the non-involved group. These syndrome domains are aggressive behavior, rule breaking, social problems, thought problems, attention problems, somatic complaints, anxiety, depression, and withdrawal depression. Similarly, the bully victim group was most likely to externalize and internalize their distress, with the bully group showing a higher tendency to internalize and be less likely to externalize than the victim-only group. This outcome is also somewhat unexpected, as the automatic assumption is the opposite, that victims process their distress more internally than perpetrators, whose aberrant behaviors are often viewed as externalized reactions. Such acts include oppositional defiance, conduct disorder, antisocial personality, related behavior, delinquency, violent and criminal behavior, and substance use problems. Signs of psychological distress were present at high levels for bullies and bully victims compared to victims and non-involved subjects who scored the lowest for most measures. Bully victims were the most depressed, anxious, and stressed, and reported the lowest self-esteem. Victims showed higher levels of depression, anxiety, and stress than bullies only. Bullies have a more positive health profile compared to victims, except for more problematic substance use. Although bully victims had higher levels of self-esteem and self-confidence than bullies overall, they also felt more rejected and incapable or weak, but far less so than the victim group, which indicates that the core difference between the two types. Some victims are passive and loners by nature. They are emotionally imbalanced and have poor emotional regulation and social cognition. They also lack resilience, coping, and self-defense skills. They are easily provoked and emotionally aroused. Many victims also engage in bullying themselves. Victims of cyberbullying also disproportionately tend to have negative thoughts about themselves and others, and they are more prone to depression and anxiety. They often come from a disruptive and adverse family, school, or community environment and are noticeably rejected and isolated by peers. Self-related cognitions, peer status, and social competence are the three main predictors of being a victim of cyberbullying, with externalizing and internalizing behavior moderate predictors. Remember, these are both bullies and victims, so they both internalize internalize their victimhood, and they externalize their bullyinghood. Corporeal victims bullied for a physical aspect are more likely to demonstrate the internalizing of existing symptoms, engage in externalizing behavior, lack adequate social skills, possess negative self-related cognitions, experience difficulties in solving social problems, come from negative community, family, and school environments, be noticeably rejected and isolated by peers. I used to live in Mississippi, and in Mississippi, the public schools are about 75% African American and 25% white. I had a student when I was teaching at Mississippi University for Women, and she claimed, or she complained that she was bullied when she was in high school because she was a minority as far as that public school was concerned. Now, the interesting thing about Mississippi is that it's about 35% African American and 65% white. But the public schools, you might ask yourself, well, how can that be? Why are the public schools, why do they have so many African American students? And the answer is because most of the white students go to private school in the South. So they have resegregated Southern schools by opening these private schools. And one of the reasons why there are a number of politicians who are trying to get the federal government to pay for private schooling is because of that reason. And in essence, all it's doing is resegregating the schools. So corporeal victims, that means that there's a physical aspect of the individual. It means that they have they look different. They are a different race. Maybe they are bullied because of a physical abnormality that they have. Anyway, that's what corporeal means. It means there's a physical aspect that that sets them apart from everybody else. Internalizing symptoms are a form of emotional and behavioral disorder characterized by depression, withdrawal, anxiety, and loneliness, often accompanied by poor self-esteem, suicidal ideation, decreased academic and vocational performance, social isolation, and psychosomatic related physical ailments. I just told you a story about a white person from Mississippi who was being bullied by African Americans. That doesn't mean that African Americans bully white people if they are in the majority. It just means that that was a an anecdotal incidence. I've also talked to a lot of black people who were being bullied by white people in the reverse situation. Obsessive compulsive behaviors, trauma-related symptoms, for example, terrifying nightmares, flashbacks, disconnectedness, and avoidance. Sleep and eating disorders like bulimia and anorexia can also be present. Externalizing symptoms commonly found among cyberbullying victims are verbal and physical aggression, substance use, smoking, suicide attempts, and self-injurious acts, including eating disorders, hyperactivity, and other conduct problems, which could include property damage. And that's what I'm showing you, property damage. And these are the victims of cyberbullying. Um, they can't they can't see their bullies, so they strike out. They do things that are negative as far as society is concerned. The internet is their society, and they see society rejecting them, and for that reason, they do things that are negative as far as society is concerned, like the physical aggression, the substance use, the smoking, suicide attempts, self-injurious acts, hyperactivity, and vandalism. One large study among 7,182 students in grades 6 through 10 established a significant overlap between bullies and victims. Among the participants, 86.4% reported not having been involved in cyberbullying, 3.8% could be considered bullies, and 5.3% victims, with the remaining 4.5% being victimized and perpetrating bullies, so-called bully victims. Social integration and status or popularity among peers are less of a determining factor, although online victims tend to feel less popular than others. Online victims, wait a minute, let's go back to that other thing. Okay, so what do we have here? We have 13.6%, and that's about 4. This is about a third, but that's more than a third. Wait a minute. It's 9. My math. 11, 12. I gotta tell them. Hey, Rox, what's up? Not yet. Okay, all right. Okay, okay. I'm online right now, so I'll look at your text message. Okay, if you want me to take him to practice, yeah, yeah. It doesn't matter. I'm online with students. Okay. So let me finish this and then I'll call you back. Okay. All right. Bye. Sorry about that. That's my daughter. Social integration and status or popularity among peers are less of a determining factor, although online victims tend to feel less popular than others. Online victims are also more likely to engage in the same behaviors themselves to bully others on the internet, thereby belonging to the bully victim group. Cyber victims tend to visit risky locations online, which could make victimization more likely. Extremist, pornographic, football hooligan, and activist sites and chat rooms. Age plays a role in how typical bully victims act out their aggressions or internalize their feelings. Older victims suffer more from depression and anxiety than the younger victims, who tend to act out as they are more likely to have undeveloped emotion regulation and impulse control skills. Effective empathy or emotional empathy is an instinctive sharing of someone else's emotions. Cyber victimization is often accompanied by a weaker ability to understand another person's perspective, both cognitively and effectively, which leads to inappropriate social responses. Distinctions between victims and bully victims. The latter group compares less favorably than both bullies and victims on most psychosocial and behavioral measures. These parameters include conduct problems, deviance, negative peer influences, depressive symptoms, lower academic performance, and negative parenting. And of course, you can see why this is true. The bullies and the victims, of course, are who they are, but the bully victims, they're living in two different worlds. They've got their legs, they've got their feet in two different worlds. And for that reason, of course, they don't, they have to act two different roles, two different opposing roles. And for that reason, you're going to see a lot more uh, negative behavior. Bullies can act one way, victims can act another way, but these are bully victims, and therefore they're going to have a lot more problems. The conduct problems, the deviance, negative peer influences, depressive symptoms, lower academic performance, and negative parenting. So these are the individuals that are going to be the biggest problem children, not the bullies, not the victims, but the bully victims. The bully victim group is generally more temperamental and more isolated socially compared to bullies, victims, and non-involved children. They also tend to favor external attributions to help explain their experiences and have a reactive disposition, which implies impulsivity and a lack of emotion regulation. Compared to the non-bullied group, cyber-bullied victims tend to be more neurotic and less agreeable, conscientious, and extroverted. Victims are predisposed to higher levels of emotional immaturity and instability, which implies an ego weakness and is characterized by lower trait emotional intelligence scores. These individuals tend to be sensitive, fretful, easily annoyed, and neurotic. They are also not detail oriented and ignore warning signals, which is associated with spontaneous reactions, lapses in judgment, and occasional poor decision making. So they get into a lot of trouble because they do not, they ignore warning signals. Victims can be dependent and demanding of attention, but prone to isolation. They also have a higher external locus of control and are dependent on the approval of others while being sensitive to criticism. Cyber victimization is strongly associated with higher levels of extroversion and openness, which can be explained by the greater number of online friends and tendency towards self disclosure that could attract negative responses. It is the combination of extroversion, openness, emotionality, and conscientiousness that may contribute to the higher risk of being a cyber victim rather than the individual traits in isolation. While a person with this type of personality constellation may appear socially adept, they may not be emotionally equipped to deal with the consequences that often accompany larger and less constrained social networks. Such experiences are likely to increase feelings of depression and anxiety and inner conflicts between the need to be accepted and popular and to be organized, in control, and able to defend themselves. When this type of dissonance occurs, two outcomes are likely. The person will either respond by becoming more active online, possibly engaging in even riskier interactions in cyberbullying, or by withdrawing into states of heightened emotional instability and possible self-harm behaviors. Males are thought to be more consistently involved in reported acts of cyberbullying than females. And age corporeal bullying is most prevalent in middle school and peaks during transitions from elementary to middle school and from middle school to high school. Why are why is it this transition? It's because they are suddenly they were the oldest, and now all of a sudden they're the youngest. So we see the same thing happening to college kids. When they're in high school as seniors, they're on top of the pack. All of a sudden they go to college and now they're at the bottom. So these are the individuals that tend to suffer the most. Victims are also targeted because of factors that set them at a disadvantage, such as religious, cultural, and other differences, such as physical differences or corporeal differences. The first of the risk factors in an individual's peer group that are likely to cause bullying is homophily, or how homogenous this social environment is. And we've already talked about Japan and how Japanese people tend to do the same thing. Of course, it's a very collectivist country. But if you live in a community where, well, uh, where I grew up, it was a Methodist town. Back in the as they were settling the United States, people from the same country of origin, English. This was an English town. This was a Swedish town. This was a German town. This was an Irish town. This was a Norwegian town, and don't get them anywhere close to the Swedes. That's the way it was. So you tended to have a major religion in each town. So the what happened in my town, it was English and German, but it was Methodist. Everybody was a Methodist. They were either a member of the German Methodist Church, they were a member of the English Methodist Church, or they're a member of the American Methodist Church. As weird as that sounds. So they were either EUB, Evangelical United Brethren, which was the German church, they were Wesleyan, which is the English Methodist Church, or they had been in the United States long enough that they didn't identify with their Englishness or with their Germanness. They were American Methodists, First Methodist Church. So it was a very homogenous community. We didn't go to church, but there was pressure on us to become Methodists, of course, because we lived in a Methodist town. And this was the 1950s, and there were a lot of crazy things going on. John Birch Society, and there was this push to be religious. The idea was that you couldn't be non-religious. Atheists were communists, or at least that's what they said. So the social environment, how homogenous is it? That's really quite important. So if you are going to a school where 75% of the population is African American and you're white, that's probably not a very good situation for you. Higher within group similarities are associated with elevated levels of low-level aggression, such as teasing, social exclusion, and rumor spreading. In a similar manner, delinquent peer norms encourage involvement in bullying as well as substance use, more so with bully victims than victims. Other environmental risk factors that increase the probability of bullying among youth are as follows. A school climate that is punitive and not supportive helps proliferate bullying behaviors. When bullying behaviors are ignored by adults, staff, and management, its prevalence is higher. Classrooms and work groups with weak negative relationships, where a lack of self-control is tolerated, and there is deficient work and learning ethics and poor problem solving, encourage bullying to continue. Feelings of school and work belonging are associated with less victimization. In communities where intolerance, crime, violence, family discord, and abuse is present at higher levels, bullying is more likely to continue unchecked. In Sweden, researchers analyzed the MMPI-2 profile of 85 bullying victims. The three groups identified with the study are the seriously affected, the disappointed and depressed, and the common. So there were three different groups of victims: the seriously affected, the disappointed and depressed, and the common. The whole sample showed high scores on hypochondriasis, depression, and hysteria. These were the clinical scales that they had high levels. There are 10 clinical scales in the MMPI. Hypochondriasis, of course, has to do with thinking that you're sick all the time. We know what depression is. Hysteria means that you overreact to things. The other scales, other than those three, are psychopathic deviant. A psychopathic deviant takes everything to extreme. Um, the next one is masculinity, femininity. In other words, you're not exactly sure if you're male or female, and that causes a lot of confusion. Paranoia, of course, psychoasthenia is another overreaction. Schizophrenia, you know what that is. Mania is acting wild all the time, and then social introversion is the last clinical scale. Individuals with all three high scores are typically diagnosed as neurotic with hypochondriacal, anxious, and depressive features, with psychophysiological reactions and somatic complaints. They often feel despondent and hopeless, are conflicted over dependency and self assertion, and suffer from sleep disturbances. They tend to keep others at an emotional distance and prefer to take few risks. And this is somebody from Sweden. That's what Swedish people look like. Oops. The seriously affected victims, which comprised almost one-third, 32% of the victims, generally had highly elevated personality profiles with the T-scores of 7 of the 10 clinical scales above 65. 4 of the scales had T-scores above 80, which are considered an extreme psychopathology. In addition to high hypochondriasis, depression, and hysteria scores, the paranoia scale was also elevated, which indicates a high level of mistrust, suspiciousness, and skepticism. So they were also paranoid, the seriously affected victims. The second group, the disappointed and depressed victims that represented almost half, about 44% of the sample, also had a raised personality profile with the same 4 clinical scales at a T above 65 than in the first cluster. I'm sorry, less than 65. However, there was less elevation at each point than those of the first group, except that the masculinity, femininity, and the hypomania scales, which were similar across all the clusters. Now, these are actually people from Sweden, and I typed in there people from Sweden, and she came up, and he came up, and he came up, and she came up. The third cluster, the common group, included 1/4 of the overall sample and displayed a relatively normal MMPI-2 personality profile with all 10 clinical scales at less than 60, T less than 60, which does not portray any psychological disturbances. Apart from an anger content scale of T greater than 60, no other content scale was raised. These results pertain to victims who were bullied at work, and that 77% of the sample were women. So about 1/4 of them were common victims. We had the depressed and discontented, what were they? Disappointed group, and then we had the highly affected group. Okay. So these were 1/4. The disappointed, depressed group were almost half, and the seriously affected were about 1/3. Games people play. Bullying perpetrators are prone to 3 specific transactional analysis games. One of them is Now I've Got You, You Son of a Bitch. Another one is Cops and Robbers, Hide and Seek. And the third one is See What You Made Me Do. Bullies tend to operate from a free child and somewhat less prevalent form from a critical parent state. Common objectives, let me read that again. That didn't come out very well. Bullies tend to operate from a free child and somewhat less prevalent from a critical parent state. Common objectives are to persecute the victim for an assumed wrongdoing or to gain ego strokes by satisfying the child's need for excitement. Byrne identified a stroke as the fundamental unit of social action, or in other words, a physical, verbal, or nonverbal act of recognition. Kick me, interaction from an adapted child to a parent ego state, with the victim confirming his or her existential position of, I'm not okay, you're okay. Here, the victim likely experiences and projects familiar feelings of shame and self pity, which can attract a wide cross section of predatory and bullying types. I'm not okay, but you're okay. And that is like putting a kick me sign on the back of your shirt. And it invites bullies. Wooden leg, acting sensitive and dependent, lacking the necessary resources to resolve issues, invariably assuming a victim role. Victims do not believe that they are able to change the situation. As a result, they are prone to apathy or anxiety and accept being bullied as their fate. This then becomes a justification for their lack of competence or motivation to take responsibility and action. As before, their payoff seems to be confirmation of their existential life position. You're okay, I'm not okay. You are taking the attitude of a victim. Poor me, this type of victim feels and acts helpless and is prone to excessive worry and other symptoms of depression, including sleep disturbances and psychosomatic complaints. Victims hold the same existential position of, you're okay, I'm not okay, but they are less needy and dependent and more likely to withdraw or isolate themselves with a defeatist, woe is me worldview. Poor, poor, pitiful me. If it weren't for you, this role is typical of bully victims who are insecure or passive and instinctively choose a dominant partner to control and restrict their activities. They don't like to take risks and instead use their dysfunctional relationship to blame the partner for issues that they could certainly control or change, should they be willing to face their fears and shortcomings. If it weren't for you, I'd be okay. Okay, so this is who they marry. They find an individual that will dominate them, and that gives them the opportunity to blame their bully or the individual in the abusive relationship. Stupid. The bullying victim functions from a depressive position, perpetuating feelings of inferiority and helplessness. He or she has a poor self image and compares him or herself negatively to others. The subconscious drive is for the victim to make the perpetrator call him or her stupid or act accordingly. Thereby, the victim relieves the pressure by feeling that everyone is satisfied with him or her as long as he or she is stupid, which relates to sustaining low expectations. I'm stupid. Call me stupid, I'll feel better. Why don't you? Yes, but. The oldest subject of game analysis and the transactional game most commonly played is why don't you, yes, but, which aims to reassure and gratify the child. Here, the bullying victim needs reassurance, but avoids surrender or disengagement by continuing to draw the perpetrator in a sense, by allowing themselves to remain the victim. They get the recognition that they desire. While the transactional games mentioned imply the victims are complicit in the exchanges and maintenance, one must remember that it applies to victims who are either unable or unwilling to escape the victim role and disengage from the dysfunctional interaction. There being a power imbalance between the perpetrator and victim, even online, the transactions between participants define their roles as perpetrators, victims, or bully victims, and define their likelihood to sustain that position repeatedly and over time. Victims operate from a position of weakness, often created by a depressive or neurotic disposition, characterized by low self esteem and either withdrawal, isolation, or sacrifice as a preferred coping mechanism. The same basic process applies to cyberspace. After the bully and victim engage, the latter is compelled by their needs and fears to maintain their engagement, thereby confirming their life script, whether it is their perceived lack of self worth or the deservedly low expectations of others. Basically, if they are not resilient and capable of accepting responsibility to act and believe that positive change is possible, they become hooked by the bully with a paralysis that prevents defensive actions. I talk a lot about people that are poor pickers, people that seem to get into relationships over and over again with the same kind of person. These are the games people play. This is why they do that. They need to be the victim. Therefore, they always select somebody. They're only attracted to people that have negative aspects. This is what alcoholics will do. Alcoholics will marry people that the children of alcoholics marry. Either they will marry an alcoholic or they will marry somebody that will dominate them, like their parents did. They have become a victim because of their parents' alcoholism, and they will find somebody they have taken this role in life, and now they will marry somebody who makes them a victim, who victimizes them. Victims are prone to being bullied, both offline and online, because of their negative views about themselves, their position in the world, and lack of hope for the future. Their instinctive coping mechanisms therefore determine how they are most likely to respond and what the probable outcomes are. An internalizing style is associated with a learned helplessness steeped in depression and anxiety, which leads to withdrawal, isolation, and self-injurious behaviors as typical responses. Externalizing behaviors are characterized by a passive reactive style, where the victim turns to becoming a perpetrator themselves. He or she acts aggressively as a means of defense, but also from a position of problematic self-related cognitions, high susceptibility, and deficient social competence. The typical bully victim can also end in physical violence toward others or themselves. The use of online chat rooms and virtual bulletin boards and forums can provide an unmediated avenue to share one's feelings with other like-minded individuals, which can be easier than talking about such thoughts and feelings in person. This can lead to something negative, such as cyber mobbing, cyber suicide pacts, virulent contagion, and harmful knowledge. Or it can be constructive in the sense of group support, awareness, education, and crisis management. Because of its convoluted and confounding nature, cyberbullying is not an easy endeavor, as the anonymity and lack of oversight associated with social interactions online complicate many strategies. Preventive and intervention efforts have to be addressed by individual, community, institutional, and policy level multi-systematic approaches aimed at potential perpetrators and victims. Social skills training and cognitive therapy can assist at-risk and affected individuals and their families to manage the psychological effects of cyberbullying and change stereotype perceptions, while education in online etiquette and safe practices can improve confidence and provide alternative solutions to desist or respond to harmful online behaviors. Parental training can also help develop more positive parent-child relationships earlier. The problem with cyberbullying is best tackled from multiple angles. Teaching youth ways of technically protecting themselves from harassment online. This is primarily achieved by blocking messages and identities, keeping information private, being selective of contacts, and reporting abuse to website administrators. Telling an adult, such as a teacher or parent, is the least used option, especially among older youth and boys, but encouragement, awareness, and sensitivity can help make this avenue more viable. Several school-based anti-bullying programs have had reasonable success rates. These typically include a well-implemented policy and awareness raising and curriculum-based activities such as computer-based classroom exercises. Another option is mentorship-type support for victims from high-status peers and empathy training for perpetrators. Bullying, including cyberbullying, is as much a behavior management issue in the educational setting as it is related to individual and family factors. By developing a safe and respectful environment, bullying behaviors are reduced and prevented. The following 9 consequential steps are proposed for responding to cyberbullying. Number 1, save the evidence, print copies of messages and websites. 2, for a first offense, if minor in nature, ignore, delete, or block the sender. Number 3, reporting. If a face or offensive profile targeting your child is set up on a social networking site, report it to the site host. Number 4, investigate. Monitor your child's online presence. Number 5, communicate. If the perpetrator is another student, share evidence with the school personnel. Number 6, parental involvement. If the perpetrator is known and cyberbullying is continuing, contact the child's parents and share your evidence. Number 7, legal advice. If the parent of the perpetrator is unresponsive and the behavior continues, contact an attorney or seek legal advice. Number 8, law enforcement. Report the cyberbullying to the police. Even if no further action is taken, a record of the incident will enable future follow-up or legal disciplinary action. And number 9, mental health support. If your child expresses emotional distress or thoughts of self-harm, seek help from a school counselor or other mental health professionals immediately. The fact that cyberbullying happens to at least 1 in 4 adults or adolescents, and the vast majority of victims and bystanders do not report the incidents to adults, necessitates an increased focus on prevention and awareness effort. And there you go. Sorry about the barking dogs. They irritated me probably, I hope, more than they irritated you, but they certainly irritated me. And of course, now that I'm finished, they're done. So I'll talk to you next week.